The easiest way to lose something valuable is to believe it has always belonged to you. The denial letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded neatly inside a white envelope stamped with the Homeowners Association logo. I opened it while standing on the wooden dock behind my workshop, listening to gentle waves lap against the old cedar pilings my father had installed decades ago. A cool breeze drifted across the water, carrying the clean scent of freshwater and pine trees from the opposite shoreline. The lake looked exactly as it had every summer of my life, calm, bright, and completely unaware that one short letter had just changed everything. The first sentence thanked me for my patience. The second sentence informed me that my request for reimbursement had been denied. The final paragraph stated that the association accepted no responsibility for the $22,000 in repairs I had paid after their landscaping contractor damaged the privately owned drainage controls protecting my shoreline during a shoreline beautification project they organized without ever contacting me. I read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and slipped it back into the envelope. Most people probably expected anger. I smiled instead, because buried inside that polite refusal was proof that the board still misunderstood something far more valuable than $22,000. They believed the lake belonged to them. Every community picnic, every fishing tournament, every summer fireworks celebration, and every neighborhood kayak event had taken place there for years. New families moved into the neighborhood, assuming the Homeowners Association owned the water because nobody ever questioned it. Why would they? The association maintained the picnic tables, trimmed the walking paths, and printed photographs of the lake across every welcome brochure. Even the entrance sign proudly called it Community Lake. Standing there with that letter in my hand, I realized Rebecca Hayes and the entire board had mistaken permission for ownership. I looked across the smooth water toward the small wooden pavilion resting near the southern shore, where children often fed ducks on warm weekends. A pair of blue herons lifted quietly into the morning sky, while sunlight shimmered across gentle ripples stretching toward the far bank. It was peaceful enough that nobody would ever imagine years of forgotten property records sleeping inside the county archives. My father used to tell me that water always remembered where it came from. At the time, I thought he was talking about rivers and rain. Years later, I realized he had been talking about paperwork. Every shoreline survey, every engineering drawing, every recorded easement, every maintenance agreement, and every deed created long before the Homeowners Association even existed still rested inside carefully labeled storage boxes in my office. I had spent most of my career as a civil engineer specializing in water management, and unlike everyone serving on that board, I actually enjoyed reading old plats and forgotten legal descriptions. The denial letter did not make me wonder how to get even. It reminded me exactly where to begin looking. I walked slowly back toward my office overlooking the lake, unlocked a heavy oak filing cabinet that had belonged to my father, and rested my hand on a thick binder labeled Original Shoreline Records. Dust floated through narrow beams of morning sunlight pouring across the room, while the quiet ticking of an old wall clock echoed between shelves packed with maps, surveys, and engineering reports. Somewhere inside those pages was a detail the Homeowners Association had overlooked for years, and before another sunrise reflected across that lake, their greatest assumption was about to become their biggest mistake. The old binder released the familiar scent of aging paper and cedar the moment I opened it. My father always insisted that important records deserved better protection than expensive furniture, and after years of working beside him, I finally understood why. Every survey, engineering drawing, shoreline permit, and maintenance agreement had been filed by hand inside thick labeled folders long before computers became part of everyday life. I carried the binder to the large drafting table overlooking the lake, where morning sunlight poured through wide windows and illuminated decades of carefully preserved history. Outside, gentle waves rolled against the dock while a pair of fishermen drifted quietly across the water, completely unaware that the legal foundation beneath their favorite fishing spot was far more complicated than anyone realized. I slowly turned the first few pages, passing faded photographs of excavation crews, handwritten construction notes, and engineering sketches showing water elevations from nearly 40 years earlier. My father had supervised the original shoreline stabilization project when the surrounding land was still open countryside instead of an established neighborhood. He believed water management required patience because one overlooked detail could affect generations. As a child, I remembered following him along the shoreline carrying survey stakes while he explained that land ownership rarely ended where people assumed it did. At the time, those lessons felt painfully boring. Years later, they became the most valuable education I ever received. My career eventually led me into civil engineering, specializing in water systems, reservoirs, drainage infrastructure, and shoreline protection. While most engineers focused on designing new projects, I found myself fascinated by forgotten records hidden inside county archives and dusty filing cabinets. Paperwork often revealed stories that buildings never could. That habit eventually became part of my everyday life. Whenever I purchased equipment, repaired shoreline structures, or renewed permits, another copy found its place inside the same oak cabinet my father once organized himself. The Homeowners Association board never seemed interested in documents older than their annual budget reports. They focused on landscaping schedules, community events, and maintenance contracts while assuming the lake had always belonged to the neighborhood simply because everyone used it. Over time, that assumption quietly became accepted as fact. Families launched kayaks from the small dock, children learned to fish beside the pavilion, and neighbors gathered every Independence Day to watch fireworks reflected across the water. None of those traditions ever bothered me because my family had always welcomed responsible public use. Permission created stronger communities. Ownership remained something entirely different. I carefully unfolded an oversized shoreline survey dated more than 3 decades earlier. Thin blue lines traced every curve of the water, while detailed notes identified retaining walls, drainage channels, access easements, and property boundaries extending far beyond the visible shoreline. Small handwritten initials in the lower corner belonged to my father. Seeing his signature brought back memories of long summer afternoons measuring elevations beneath bright skies, while he patiently explained contour lines and benchmark markers. He often smiled whenever someone confused convenience with legal rights. One day, he liked to say, "Someone will stop reading after the headline instead of finishing the whole document." Sitting there with the denial letter resting beside the survey, I realized Rebecca Hayes and the entire Homeowners Association had done exactly that. They believed years of uninterrupted access had quietly transformed private rights into public ownership. They had never bothered to discover what the original records actually said, and as I continued turning page after page, one overlooked detail slowly began to emerge from the quiet history my father had preserved all along. Late that afternoon, I drove to the county records office carrying the original binder, the denial letter, and a notebook already filling with observations. The courthouse had changed very little since my father first brought me there as a teenager. The polished stone floors reflected soft afternoon sunlight pouring through tall windows, and the quiet hum of ceiling fans mixed with the faint rustling of paper as clerks helped visitors at long wooden counters. The building always carried the unmistakable scent of old books, archival paper, and furniture polished over generations. Some people saw dusty government files. I saw the history of every property line, easement, and shoreline surrounding the lake. After checking in, I requested copies of the original subdivision plat, every shoreline easement recorded before the Homeowners Association was established, and the engineering file connected to the reservoir improvements completed decades earlier. The clerk disappeared into the archive room and returned with several oversized map tubes and a stack of carefully preserved record books. I thanked her, carried everything to a large reference table, and slowly began comparing dates, signatures, and parcel numbers. The deeper I looked, the clearer the timeline became. Long before the neighborhood existed, my grandfather had granted a limited access agreement allowing future residents to enjoy the shoreline for recreation as long as the original maintenance obligations continued to be honored. Years later, when the Homeowners Association was created, that agreement had simply been referenced without ever transferring ownership of the shoreline infrastructure, the water control structures, or the privately maintained access corridor connecting them. For decades, everyone behaved as though those distinctions no longer mattered because my family never interfered with responsible community use. Permission gradually became tradition, and tradition slowly transformed into assumption. Rebecca Hayes inherited that assumption without ever questioning where it originated. I carefully unfolded another engineering drawing showing the outlet control structure built by my father during a shoreline stabilization project more than 30 years earlier. Every retaining wall, drainage channel, inspection point, and maintenance easement had been surveyed with remarkable precision. Near the lower corner, a handwritten note immediately caught my attention. It stated that all operational access required the written consent of the owner of Parcel 12 unless modified by a future recorded agreement. I stopped reading for several seconds and checked the parcel number against the county map. Parcel 12 was still my property. I searched through every amendment recorded after the neighborhood was developed. None removed that requirement. None transferred ownership. None expanded the homeowners association's rights beyond the original limited recreational access. Outside the courthouse windows, late afternoon sunlight reflected across parked vehicles while tree branches moved gently in the summer breeze. Inside, I quietly copied every relevant page, certified several historical records, and organized them inside a new folder. The denial letter now looked almost insignificant compared with what rested beside it. $22,000 had started this dispute, but the real issue had never been the repair invoice. It was decades of overlooked paperwork quietly protecting rights that almost everyone had forgotten existed. As I left the courthouse carrying the expanded file beneath my arm, I realized Rebecca and the board still believed they controlled the lake because nobody had ever challenged that belief. They had no idea that the oldest documents in the county archives were about to remind them that legal ownership does not disappear simply because people stop reading the records. The following morning I met with an attorney whose office overlooked the county courthouse square. Large windows filled the conference room with bright natural light, while shelves lined with legal reference books surrounded a polished oak table already covered with the documents I had organized the night before. Outside, people walked through the quiet downtown streets without realizing that a decades-old shoreline agreement was about to become far more important than anyone expected. My attorney studied each survey, deed, engineering drawing, and certified county record without interrupting. Occasionally, he made notes in the margin before comparing one document against another. Nearly an hour passed before he finally leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You have something unusual," he said. "Most people stop reading after the deed. Your family preserved every supporting agreement." He carefully pointed toward the handwritten maintenance clause I had discovered inside the engineering records. The language was remarkably simple. Recreational access could continue only while the operational shoreline infrastructure remained under the control of the owner of Parcel 12 unless another recorded agreement replaced it. We searched every amendment filed over the following decades. None existed. The Homeowners Association had inherited permission to enjoy the lake, but had never acquired the legal authority to control the privately maintained shoreline systems supporting that access. My attorney explained the difference with calm precision. Ownership, maintenance responsibility, operational control, and recreational use were separate legal concepts even when people treated them as though they were identical. Rebecca Hayes and the board had combined them into one assumption because nobody had challenged that interpretation for years. We decided our next step would remain completely professional. Instead of filing a lawsuit immediately, my attorney prepared a formal notice summarizing the historical records, attaching certified copies of the relevant documents, and requesting that the Homeowners Association reconsider both the denied reimbursement and its understanding of the shoreline agreements. The letter also requested a meeting before any additional action became necessary. I appreciated that approach because my father always believed reasonable conversations should come before legal disputes whenever possible. That afternoon, I personally delivered the sealed envelope to the Homeowners Association office overlooking the lake. Families relaxed beneath shade trees nearby while children laughed along the walking path leading toward the pavilion. Canoes drifted peacefully across the water, and several neighbors waved as I passed. Seeing everyone enjoy the lake reminded me why my family had preserved public access for so many years. None of this had ever been about keeping good neighbors away from the shoreline. It was about correcting a dangerous misunderstanding that had gradually become accepted as truth. Rebecca accepted the envelope with a polite smile that quickly faded when she noticed the certified county seals attached to several pages. She glanced through the first few documents before placing the folder on her desk. The board already made its decision, she said confidently. I do not believe these older records change anything. I simply thanked her for accepting the notice and walked back outside without another word. The warm afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh cut grass and lake water across the shoreline, while sunlight shimmered across the quiet surface exactly as it always had. Behind me, the Homeowners Association office looked perfectly ordinary. Inside, however, rested a folder containing documents that challenged everything the board believed about the lake they proudly called their own. They still thought the conversation was about $22,000. They had not yet realized it had become a question of who actually controlled the legal rights they had taken for granted for decades. 3 days passed without a response. On the fourth morning, my attorney received an electronic copy of the Homeowners Association Board's official decision. Rebecca Hayes and the board had unanimously rejected every point raised in our notice. According to their letter, the historical agreements no longer carried practical significance because the community had used the lake openly for decades. They repeated that the association considered the shoreline facilities to be community assets and again refused to reimburse the $22,000 I had already spent repairing the damaged drainage controls. I read the letter while sitting at the end of my dock just after sunrise. Gentle waves rolled beneath the weathered cedar planks, and a light breeze carried the fresh scent of pine needles across the quiet water. Several ducks drifted slowly through patches of morning mist while the first rays of sunlight reflected across the lake in long bands of gold. Everything around me felt peaceful, which made the board's confidence seem strangely out of place. My attorney called a few minutes later. He sounded calm, almost amused. They answered exactly the way I expected, he said. Now we move to the next step. That afternoon we met again, this time with a licensed land surveyor and a consulting engineer experienced in shoreline infrastructure. The conference room table quickly disappeared beneath certified plats, maintenance agreements, engineering drawings, aerial photographs, and county records stretching back more than 40 years. One document after another confirmed the same conclusion. The Homeowners Association possessed permission to organize recreational activities around the lake, but the operational shoreline corridor, the inspection access route, the control structures, and the maintenance easements remained tied to Parcel 12 under the original recorded agreements. The surveyor compared every modern boundary monument with the historical plats before quietly nodding. Nothing has changed, he said. The records are remarkably consistent. The engineer reached a similar conclusion after reviewing the maintenance documents. He explained that the shoreline stabilization system and inspection access could not legally be maintained by people lacking authorization from the recorded property owner because those responsibilities remained specifically assigned under the original agreements. Hearing independent professionals reach the same conclusion strengthened my confidence, but it also reminded me of something my father often repeated. He believed preparation won more disputes than emotion ever could. Instead of rushing into court, we assembled an organized package containing updated surveys, expert opinions, certified historical records, and a formal notice advising the Homeowners Association that continued recreational access depended upon compliance with the recorded maintenance agreements already preserved in county records. Every page relied on facts rather than accusations. Every statement referenced existing legal documents instead of opinions. Late that afternoon, I walked slowly along the shoreline path, where families often gathered on warm weekends. Children laughed near the pavilion, while neighbors unloaded kayaks beside the small dock. Watching them enjoy the lake reminded me once again that none of this was directed toward the community. My goal had never been to keep honest neighbors away from the water they loved. My concern rested entirely with a board that believed repeated assumptions could replace recorded property rights. As the evening sun settled behind the trees, I placed the completed legal notice into a certified mailing envelope addressed to Rebecca Hayes. The documents inside did not threaten anyone, demand revenge, or seek unnecessary conflict. They simply informed the Homeowners Association that if they continued ignoring the agreements attached to the shoreline, they might soon discover that permission, once withdrawn according to the original recorded terms, could change the future of the lake far more than they ever imagined. 5 business days later, the certified mail receipt returned with Rebecca Hayes' signature across the bottom, confirming that every document had reached the Homeowners Association office exactly as intended. My attorney waited another 48 hours before checking for a response. None arrived. There was no request for a meeting, no question about the historical records, and no attempt to dispute the certified surveys we had included. Silence can reveal just as much as an argument, especially when every fact has already been placed on the table. We decided it was time to exercise rights that had always existed rather than continue debating whether they existed at all. Early the next morning, I met my attorney, the licensed surveyor, and the consulting engineer at the shoreline maintenance corridor identified throughout the original agreements. A light fog floated above the lake while the first rays of sunlight reflected across perfectly calm water. Songbirds moved through the tall pine branches overhead, and the only other sound came from gentle waves touching the stone shoreline my father had helped reinforce decades earlier. The surveyor carefully located every permanent boundary monument and confirmed that the inspection corridor, maintenance access route, and shoreline control structures remained entirely within Parcel 12 exactly as the historical plats described. The engineer completed his inspection and documented that future maintenance could only be scheduled through the recorded owner responsible for the infrastructure. Nothing about the inspection changed the lake itself. Nothing interfered with the water. We simply documented existing property rights that had never been transferred away from my family. Later that afternoon, professionally manufactured signs arrived exactly as my attorney had approved them. Each sign carried simple language. Private maintenance access. Authorized personnel only. Recreational access subject to recorded easement terms. Contact property owner for operational authorization. The wording sounded almost ordinary, yet every sentence matched the original recorded agreements preserved in the county archives. We installed the signs only within the privately owned maintenance corridor and beside the controlled shoreline access points identified by the survey. No public roads were blocked. No neighboring properties were disturbed. The lake remained as peaceful as ever. Families could still admire the water from public viewpoints, but the operational areas supporting organized community access were now clearly identified according to the recorded documents. By early evening, I received a phone call from Rebecca. Her voice sounded noticeably different from our previous conversations. "What exactly are those new signs supposed to mean?" she asked. I answered calmly. "They reflect the recorded maintenance agreements attached to Parcel 12. Nothing more." She insisted the homeowners association had always managed the lake. I quietly explained that tradition and ownership were not the same legal concept. The agreements have always required authorization from the recorded owner for operational access, I said. We simply restored the language everyone stopped paying attention to. She ended the call after a long silence. As sunset painted the water in shades of orange and gold, I walked slowly along the shoreline path where my father once taught me how to read survey stakes hidden beneath tall grass. Everything around the lake appeared exactly as it had the week before, yet one important difference now existed. For the first time in decades, the official records, the physical property, and the visible signs all told the same story. The homeowners association could no longer rely on assumptions because every person approaching the shoreline would soon discover that the lake had never actually belonged to the board. They had only been enjoying privileges my family had quietly allowed for generations, and those privileges now depended entirely upon respecting the agreements they had chosen to ignore. The first real test arrived that Saturday morning when the Homeowners Association held its annual Summer on the Lake celebration exactly as it had for years. By 8 o'clock, colorful tents lined the grassy recreation area, families unfolded lawn chairs beneath tall oak trees, and volunteers arranged tables filled with homemade desserts while children laughed beside stacks of bright orange life jackets waiting for the kayak races to begin. From a distance, the morning looked exactly like every previous community gathering, but one important difference quietly waited near the shoreline maintenance corridor. I stood several hundred feet away beside the old stone boathouse my father had restored decades earlier, watching the scene unfold while sipping a cup of black coffee. The lake reflected the clear blue sky like polished glass, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh water, sunscreen, and newly cut grass across the shoreline. Within minutes, the first event organizers reached the professionally marked access point leading to the maintenance corridor and boat launch infrastructure identified in the recorded agreements. They stopped almost immediately after reading the posted notices. Several volunteers looked at one another in confusion before pulling out their phones. A few minutes later, Rebecca Hayes arrived in a golf cart with two other board members. She stepped out confidently and walked directly toward me, holding copies of the signs my attorney had already reviewed. "You cannot suddenly change decades of community tradition," she said. I answered calmly. "Nothing changed today. The recorded agreements have existed longer than the homeowners association." She insisted the community expected full lake access for the scheduled activities. I quietly explained that recreational use had always depended upon the operational corridor remaining under the authority of the recorded owner, exactly as the original documents required. Before the conversation continued any further, the licensed surveyor we had retained arrived with certified copies of the plats and historical easement maps. Shortly afterward, my attorney joined us, carrying the county's certified records already delivered to the board earlier that week. Rebecca reviewed the documents again, while several curious residents gathered nearby, not to argue, but simply to understand what was happening. Many admitted they had always assumed the homeowners association owned the entire lake because that was what everyone had believed for years. My attorney patiently explained the distinction between public recreation, private maintenance responsibilities, recorded easements, and legal ownership. The explanation remained respectful, detailed, and completely supported by county records. No raised voices interrupted the discussion. No dramatic confrontation occurred. Instead, facts slowly replaced assumptions one page at a time. By late morning, a representative from the county planning office arrived after receiving questions from several residents. He compared the certified plats with the property database on his tablet before confirming that the historical documents accurately reflected the current county records. The maintenance corridor, shoreline control structures, and operational access remained connected to Parcel 12 exactly as originally recorded. Rebecca stood quietly beside the information table overlooking the lake, reading through the documents for what seemed like the first time without interruption. Around us, the community gathering continued in a modified form. Families still enjoyed picnics beneath the trees, children watched ducks along the shoreline, and neighbors spent the afternoon talking with one another. The only activity temporarily postponed involved facilities the homeowners association had never actually possessed the legal authority to control. Watching the residents calmly absorb that reality, I realized the lake itself had never been taken away from anyone. The truth had simply surfaced after decades of being quietly hidden beneath assumptions that no longer survived contact with the original records. Monday morning began with a message from Rebecca Hayes requesting an emergency meeting with my attorney and me at the Homeowners Association office overlooking the lake. The tone of her electronic mail was completely different from every previous letter the board had sent. There were no confident declarations about community ownership, no dismissal of historical agreements, and no mention of the reimbursement request being permanently denied. Instead, the message simply asked whether we would be willing to discuss a practical resolution. We arrived shortly before 10 o'clock, carrying the same organized binders that had quietly guided every step of this process. Sunlight poured through the large conference room windows, reflecting across the calm surface of the lake beyond, while the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the room. Several board members sat around the long table with copies of the certified plats, engineering drawings, and county records already spread in front of them. I immediately noticed handwritten notes covering documents that had barely been opened when I delivered them only a week earlier. Rebecca greeted us politely before taking a slow breath. "We asked an independent property attorney to review everything," she said. "The conclusion matches yours." The room remained completely silent for several seconds. No one argued. No one questioned the county records any longer. The attorney retained by the Homeowners Association had confirmed that the original recreational access agreement never transferred ownership of the shoreline infrastructure, maintenance corridor, operational control structures, or the authority attached to Parcel 12. The board had inherited the privilege of using the lake, but not the legal right to claim the facilities supporting that use as community property. My attorney carefully opened a prepared settlement proposal and slid copies across the conference table. The agreement was straightforward. The Homeowners Association would reimburse the documented $22,000 spent repairing the damaged drainage controls, formally acknowledge the recorded property rights preserved in the county archives, recognize the operational authority attached to Parcel 12, and enter into a new written access agreement establishing clear responsibilities for future maintenance, inspections, and organized community events. Nothing inside the proposal prevented families from enjoying the lake. In fact, the agreement permanently protected recreational access by replacing decades of assumptions with clearly defined legal obligations. Rebecca slowly turned each page before looking toward the other board members. One after another, they quietly nodded. Several admitted they had accepted old stories instead of reading the original records themselves. One director apologized for assuming that years of uninterrupted use automatically created ownership. Another acknowledged that rejecting the reimbursement request without fully investigating the historical agreements had been a costly mistake. After a brief recess, the board voted unanimously to approve the settlement exactly as presented. Every required signature was placed on the agreement before the meeting ended. Later that afternoon, the Homeowners Association issued a written notice to residents explaining that updated property records had clarified the legal status of the shoreline infrastructure and that recreational access would continue under a newly documented partnership with the recorded property owner. Standing outside beside the quiet lake after the meeting concluded, I watched families walking peacefully along the shoreline trail exactly as they had for years. The only real difference was that the truth now stood beside the water as clearly as the reflection shimmering across its surface. The lake itself had never changed. The documents had never changed. Only the understanding of who held the legal rights had finally caught up with the facts that had been waiting patiently in the county archives all along. Several weeks later, the reimbursement check cleared without delay. The new shoreline agreement had been officially recorded with the county, and every question surrounding the lake had finally been answered by documents instead of assumptions. I visited the shoreline just before sunrise on the first cool morning of early autumn, carrying nothing more than a thermos of coffee and the same weathered binder that had quietly guided me through the entire dispute. A thin layer of mist floated across the water while the first rays of sunlight painted the surface in soft shades of gold and silver. The gentle sound of small waves touching the cedar dock blended with distant birdsong exactly as it had when I stood beside my father years earlier learning how to read survey maps and property descriptions. I placed the binder on the old bench overlooking the lake and slowly opened it one final time. The newest document rested neatly behind the original agreements, completing a paper trail that now stretched across more than 4 decades. Every survey, every engineering drawing, every maintenance record, every easement, and every signed agreement told the same story from beginning to end. The facts had never changed. Only people's understanding of those facts had changed. A few minutes later, families began arriving for another weekend by the water. Children carried fishing poles toward the dock, while neighbors unloaded kayaks with relaxed smiles, and several people waved as they recognized me sitting beneath the tall oak trees. The difference now was almost invisible unless someone understood the history behind it. Community activities continued exactly as before, but every event operated under a clear written agreement that respected both private property rights and public recreational access. The confusion that had existed for years had quietly disappeared because everyone finally understood where permission ended and ownership began. Rebecca Hayes eventually walked toward the shoreline carrying a folder of updated Homeowners Association policies. She stopped beside the bench and looked across the calm lake before speaking. "The board approved every revision," she said. "Future directors will receive copies of the original agreements during orientation so this never happens again." I thanked her sincerely because that decision mattered more than any reimbursement check ever could. Protecting accurate records would prevent future misunderstandings long after both of us were gone. Before leaving, Rebecca extended her hand. We shook hands politely, not because either of us had forgotten the disagreement, but because the disagreement had finally been resolved the right way. She walked back toward the community pavilion while I remained beside the water listening to the breeze moving gently through the pine trees. Looking across the quiet lake, I thought about the phrase many neighbors had repeated after the settlement. They joked that I had legally stolen the lake from the Homeowners Association. The truth was much simpler. I had never taken the lake away from anyone. My family had owned the legal rights connected to its shoreline infrastructure all along. The only thing I recovered was the recognition of rights that had been overlooked for decades. The lake remained exactly where it had always been, welcoming families, fishermen, kayakers, and neighbors who appreciated its beauty. What changed was that every person now understood that respect for property, careful record-keeping, patience, and the rule of law create stronger communities than assumptions ever could. As I closed the old binder and watched another peaceful sunrise spread across the water, I smiled quietly because my father had been right all along. Water always remembers where it comes from, and eventually, so does the truth.